Добрый день всем. Good afternoon to everybody. My name is Andrius Kubilius. I am a member of European Parliament, and I also chair informal forum which we established in European Parliament, Forum of the Friends of European Russia, and we organized this event together with the Open Russia Foundation. And of course, topic is very clear. There is no need to describe the topic very much. Questions are very simple. What is happening in Russia and what will happen in Russia, starting from things like pandemics, economy, and also political and constitutional developments. Before I will move into introduction of our speakers, I will try to explain some technology. We shall have simultaneous translation. Those who want to listen only to English should press button in front of on the screen, where you need to choose which language you want to listen. There is a possibility to choose either English or Russian language. You can stay with originals, and you will have possibility to listen to both languages. We shall have some breaks for interpreter. But also I would like to mention that we shall have presentation from Mikhail KHODORKOVSKY at the beginning, and other speakers whom I will introduce. Then there will be the possibility to ask the questions, but please write your questions again on screen in a special room for chat. I will read them, and that is how things will go on. So I will very briefly at the very beginning will try to introduce all the speakers. Well, Mikhail KHODORKOVSKY, of course, is very well known. There is no need to introduce him very broadly. We know all that stories, all those stories which he suffered. We met personally, I met Mikhail KHODORKOVSKY back perhaps in 2002 or 2003, when he is a successful businessman owning Yukos, also quite a refinery in Lithuania. And then, of course, we remember how, because of his activities in order to strengthen civil society in Russia, he was arrested and Yukos property was stolen from him. So we know what Mikhail Chodorkovsky is doing now, very important job. Mikhail is a prominent advocate of alternative vision for his country, a strong and just state committed to observing human rights, free and fair elections, and the rule of law. That is also our dream, to see Russia developing in such a way. Then Anastasia Burakova was elected the chairperson of Open Russia in April 2019. She has been actively involved in human rights advocacy and democratic activism since 2011. As a lead member of the Open Russia human rights team, Anastasia provides legal assistance to Russian citizens, and also she is a founder of United Democrats Project. So welcome also to our forum, Anastasia. And next speaker, which I will try also to present very briefly, very well-known professor, economist Evgeny Gontmacher, expert on Russia, economical and social development. And the professor was serving in different capacities, starting from being Deputy Minister of Social Protection since 1992 till 2003 in all other capacities in Russian government. Now he is professor at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow, an academic director of the expert group European Dialogue and secretary of board of the Institute for Contemporary Development. And the last speaker, Ella Paneyakh, is a docent of the Sociology Department, National Research University Higher School of Economics, St. Petersburg campus, and she is very well-known expert on sociology in Russia. She was involved with European University at St. Petersburg and with University of Michigan. And she is also a very well-known columnist for Vedomosti, and she published in a lot of other different magazines like Forbes Russia, New Times, Novaya Gazeta, etc. So those are our speakers. I just introduced for those who will watch our discussion on YouTube. It's a recorded discussion, and I hope that we shall have really very interesting and very fruitful discussion on what is happening, what is going on in Russia. And of course, the first whom we shall ask to speak will be Mikhail KHODORKOVSKY. As I said, we know him very well. And dear Mikhail, can you say us, for the beginning, how you see all those developments in Russia, which we are trying to follow, both from Brussels or from Vilnius or from other capitals of EU, how you see pandemics, how you see economical developments, and of course, how you see and what you foresee in political developments going on in Russia. And I would ask each speaker to speak around of 8 or 10 minutes, and then after, as I said, we shall move into Q&A session.
Приветствую, уважаемые дамы и господа.
Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. I shall leave the pandemic and the economy as a whole to my more experienced colleagues. A few words about oil. The general idea in Russia, whether it's just or not so fair, is that the sharp decline in the oil prices is the result of the mistakes. Mr. Sechen's and Mr. Putin's mistakes, who had decided to make a strike against the shale oil of the US and chose the wrong moment to do that. This story with oil is not particularly pleasant, but not fatal for the oil business in Russia. The general cost of oil, cost of production, including transportation, is about $20 for Russian oil. But stopping production would lead to the losses from 10 to 30% of all the oil wells that have been mothballed. So depending on the different approaches to the mothballing of the oil wells, and that, of course, will depend on the greed or of the management's greed. The influence of that or the impact on the Russian budget, I would leave to my qualified colleague, Evgeny. But of course, this impact is not going to be fatal either. We think by the end of the year, the prices would go back to the range from $40 to $60 because of the reduction in production in the OPEC countries. Could the moderator switch off the microphone because we have the interference? Unfortunately, the black swan, the so-called black swan, arrived not alone, or perhaps it's fortunate, depending on your point of view. Mr. Putin's address to the Federal Assembly, announcing the changes to the Constitution, although came as no surprise, but still became yet another black swan, the so-called black swan. It was the result of the refusal of President Lukashenko for Belarus to be integrated as a region into the Russian Federation, and that removed from the chessboard the best option out of the three to prolong Putin's term in office. Option 2 for Putin, in terms of his comfort, was the decision with the State Council, the move with the State Council, to move him to the head of the State Council, but it was obviously taken off the board, the chessboard, as Putin explained later, for the fear of duality of power. Putin declared or announced the transfer of power to the State Duma, but the published amendments in fact revealed the opposite, the reverse. The Duma even further lost the last remains or remnants of its powers in favor of the president. Moreover, the president bit off another piece of power from the judicial system, giving himself the powers to initiate the dismissal of judges. We're talking about amendment to Division 4 of Article 83 of the Constitution. So Putin declared the repudiation of the signed international agreements on the basis of the decision of his puppet Constitutional Court. So this new amendment of Article 79, and it reads as follows: the decision of transnational or international bodies based on international treaties signed by the Russian Federation and their treatment which contradict the Constitution of the Russian Federation should not be administered on the territory of the Russian Federation. So basically, the language is quite casuistic, but you can see that they decided to do what they want. For Putin himself, all these changes overall are not very significant. And in fact, this is why there was no serious reaction or opposition in society to them, because they simply legalized the status quo. Still, the amendments still have new restrictions on civil and human rights. For instance, in Article 71, positions or officials to municipal, state, and municipal service and replacement of state officials is prohibited if you have or you hold citizenship of a foreign state or residence permit or a document confirming the right of a Russian citizen to permanently reside on the territory of a foreign state. The new Part 3 of Article 77 introduced the new criteria for top officials of the constituent entities of the Russian Federation. It prohibits to take the office if you hold citizenship of a foreign state or residence permit of a foreign state, and so on and so forth. All this was masked or disguised by the pseudo-socially orientated articles. For example, Part 5 of Article 75 guarantees the minimum monthly wage being no less than the minimum subsistence level. But in fact, it was already established in a different document, in the constitutional law. So this is obviously a PR stunt. Another amendment to Article 6 or Part 6 of Article 75 establishes a lot of important guarantees on pension provisions and regularly indexing pensions, but in fact, this is just a declarative move. So you should realize that when we look at all these amendments, we have some idiocy here. Why does Putin need all these amendments, which in fact are no use to him personally? The only goal that one could suspect was that he wanted to task his subordinates to introduce sufficient amendments in order to say that the constitution is a new constitution and therefore it could zero out his term of office. And yet it is not so new that the referendum should be held, because if you hold a referendum, then it would take at least 1 year. and Putin wanted to get the approval by the 9th of May, and then legitimize all the changes by the arrival of all the leaders of leading states, global states. That legitimization was very important for Putin. But this delusion didn't last long. The important astronaut Tereshkova, an MP, introduced an amendment that would allow Putin to remain in power for another 12 years after the end of that term. That is until 2036. So this particular amendment that put everything in its place, although before it was only clear to professionals, those who are well-versed in law and constitutional amendments, now it became the black swan that led to a lot of outrage in society. It certainly wasn't met with unanimous approval. And because Putin was afraid to hold the referendum because it would stretch it out in time and he couldn't be assured of the result, he made up the result. Well, it's not himself, but Zorkin. This whole idea of voting was invented. In order to do that, he had to renounce the amendments to chapters 1 and 2, which require a referendum. And this is why there was a mishmash with all the amendments. I told you about the amendments to the article about international treaties, where he introduced the amendment to Article 79. But in fact, there is Article 15 still remaining that spells out the reverse, the priority of international law. And today the Constitution, on many of its aspects, is internally contradictory. Chapters 1 and 2 contravene the changes that have been introduced, or amendments have been introduced to other chapters. So it's very difficult to understand how the lawyers are going to work with this new document, unless they overlook a lot of important issues. So why has Putin decided to do this rather mad voting? It's a rather comic story, and lawyers have been thinking about it a lot. And finally, the leading constitutional experts have come to an overall opinion why this has been done. And that opinion was confirmed informationally later on. So, the reason was as follows. Putin wants legitimacy. He thinks that he is somebody who follows the law to the letter, and he decided to extend his term in office by supplementing it with the decision or the ruling by the Constitutional Court. But according to the existing constitution, the court cannot pass judgment on draft constitutions. And at the same time, it has been provided with this right by the new draft that Putin has just introduced. But at the same time, if the constitution does come into force, the Constitutional Court will not be able to make a decision on its constitutionality, because it functions on the basis of the Constitution but doesn't discuss the Constitution itself. And this is why this idiotic idea with voting was invented, when already approved and signed amendments are not being published, and the Constitutional Court invents a lasting entry into force or continuous entry into force of amendments. And at the same time, it usurps the right to approve the constitutionality of the constitution that has not come into force. So this is, in terms of legal issues, is a total nightmare for a small group of lawyers, and the whole country is crazy because they don't know how to treat or how to interpret this idea. So the delirium should not have lasted long, but then the coronavirus struck, and the population who greeted this idea of zeroing out Putin's past terms without much enthusiasm, 51 by 49, moved to total obstruction. And at the same time, other things influenced the public sentiment. For instance, the total confusion and helplessness of the first person in his many addresses to the people, to the population about the COVID-19, because he has shifted the responsibility to regional leaders. It would be normal in any Western country, but here it contradicts the cult of power that he imposed on the regional leaders before, because he wanted to show that he was the master of that country. And now he's saying, no, I'm not responsible for anything. I'm not liable for anything. And now there is this cognitive dissonance as a result. Another huge blow to the economy and public sentiment has been dealt by his refusal to support SMEs. We're talking about 15 to 20 million people who are not being supported, and people have this feeling that the so-called stash, the National Reserve Fund, has been plundered. I'm not going to talk to you about the economic aspects, as I've already mentioned, but in reality, even if the stash has been plundered, such behavior can only be explained by the total confusion and lack of expert knowledge in the entourage of Putin. Because even if the stash has been plundered, having the printing press, you could have done anything you want. So basically, it's going to be very difficult for the regime to keep Putin as a savior from this terrible disaster, which is COVID-19. Even if people decide that this was a total rubbish and that the epidemic didn't really exist, and many people think that, still people will remember the economic humiliation and the weakness exercised or demonstrated by Putin. And now the society is aware of the terrible state of the healthcare outside Moscow, including Moscow, but particularly outside Moscow. It's a total disaster. It's a total nightmare. I know that people in the West also complain about the state of their healthcare systems, but believe me, it's an entirely different type of disaster in Russia, because many hospitals simply don't have any water supplies, let alone hot water and PPEs. It all existed before COVID-19, but people paid no attention to that, but now they do. And this leads to the total instability of the system, which objectively still has quite a few reserves at hand. And it is exactly because of that. It is so important for Putin to remove the sanctions against his officials. Such sanctions and fighting dirty money don't just strike a blow to the possibility of financing this inefficient state economy, increasing the state debt, but they also limit his possibility to influence his neighbors and also undermine the feeling of stability by the elite and the entourage, and forces them to look for alternatives. And in this status quo, there are three options, three ways out. The most likely one is the strengthening role of law enforcement officials, of siloviki. The second, which is also quite likely, is Putin's attempt to regain confidence in themselves to the elites. And the final, perhaps least likely, but also a realistic option, is the change of the figurehead of the first person, even with the minimum additional crisis. Mass falsifications during voting or vote rigging could rock the boat even further, particularly on the eve of the elections planned next year. And the opposition will definitely test the system already in the forthcoming autumn, and then we will see what happens. Thank you.
Now, as we agreed, we shall ask Professor Evgeny Gontmacher to speak about economical and social developments in Russia. And please, Professor, floor is yours. you should, вы можете микрофон включить. You should push your microphone. Some kind of problems. Okay, maybe I don't know what's happening now. But it looks like that we lost connection with Professor. So can I ask next speaker then, Ella? Yeah, on sociology, can you Ella Paneyakh, can you tell us a few words about how sociology is looking like, and if Professor will come back, we shall put him on microphone.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here, even online. Я хочу поговорить
To speak about what is in fact happening in everyday people's lives. The changes that have been introduced into people's everyday lives. All the government measures to fight the pandemic, in fact, exceed any other changes. In fact, it has never happened in the past 20 years of the Putin regime. It has never happened that the ordinary decisions by the authorities changed so radically people's everyday life just in one move, by one stroke of pen. So the events that could be compared with it in some way, which is the pension reform of 2018, in fact, has put it on a different level. It has, in fact, reduced the additional ratings that Putin himself and the federal authorities as a whole and different bodies enjoyed as a result of rallying around the flag by that time. But even that has not impacted in the same negative way, the pension reform, people's lives as today's situation. Today, what's happening that people have deal with the government and the state the way it is in its quality, in its status. And the ratings, the approval or disapproval ratings of the federal authorities, different types of ratings, haven't really shifted very much, just by a few percent. And in fact, you shouldn't really take into account these shiftings or these changes, because the technology of surveys has also changed, because in the past it was that people going from flat to flat canvassing. Now it is telephone surveys because of the quarantine or the lockdown. And in itself, such small shifts or changes are insignificant. But in the majority of countries, governments, including those which are not popular or were not popular before the beginning of the epidemic, have got a vote of confidence from their voters, from their citizens, and the growth of their ratings. Maybe in the future they'll lose their ratings. But at the beginning, to begin with, those ratings are quite high. But the benefit of the doubt in Russia has been exhausted. The ratings, Putin's was 60%, the new government 50% rating, popular ratings. But the ruling party's rating has been stably low, about 30%, and those ratings have not really changed much over the past period. There is absolutely no opportunity to raise them in this extreme situation, in the critical situation we face today. So the first two addresses by the president on March the 25th and April the 2nd, the reactions were quite positive, but there was a decrease in positivity. The first was approved by 72%, the second only by 62%, and the third one that happened yesterday, we still don't know results about that in terms of people's attitude to it. But what we do know is that the number of people who think that the measures that have been taken are sensible is going down all the time because they are uncomfortable, inconvenient, but nevertheless. Against the background of people's attempts to survive in the quarantine or lockdown situation, all the constitutional changes and their reception by the people have moved to the background. To begin with, people were not particularly outraged. No, there was no outrage, but they were quite indifferent to those projected changes. They said, well, yes, if you want us to go to vote, we shall go and vote on the constitutional changes, but there was no strong emotional reaction. There was quite a demure reaction. It was clear that people just wouldn't go out and vote. And because of that, they had to introduce the second wave of amendments, trying to get some kind of mobilize socially the population. But now, the recommendations to introduce the definition of marriage as marriage between a man and a woman into the constitution, into some article, not the article on marriage, but other articles. There were lots of articles on or proposals of this kind before, but now nobody bothers about them because now people are sitting without any wages being paid, isolated in their homes. So what is happening in people's everyday lives? Russia has a few peculiar features which makes lockdown very problematic. To begin with, they don't have any savings. The data we have for April 2019, a year ago, before the crisis struck, show that 65% of Russian families do not have any savings whatsoever. And even in the upper quintile, only half have savings, and that amounts to about 3 times their monthly wage. The rest, even those who have some savings, only have less than a monthly wage of savings. So people are running out of money, and they're running out of money today. Russian people live distributively, which doesn't exist in Europe. 75% of Russians live in urban areas, but over 60% of them have a summer cottage or a garden plot or an allotment. Now we have the beginning of May, the long festive holiday period, and it is the planting season. During the economic crisis, naturally people are afraid of starvation, hunger, and they want to plant as much as possible in their plots. But we have restrictions and cordons, and this is not very easy for people. Regional authorities are trying to strike a deal with the population. For instance, in St. Petersburg, where I live, the authorities have struck a deal with the region, and now during the May holiday, they allow people to go to their summer cottages or garden plots. But there is a different format of care for the elderly and the disabled, which still exists in Russia. In Russia, it is still first and foremost the family who cares for the elderly and the disabled. But in Soviet times, it meant that people shared a flat or a house as an extended family. Today, they do not take the elderly back into the family house, but use a combination. For instance, an elderly person lives alone, and of course we have a life expectancy is different between men and women, and it's usually women who are still living alone. They have a state social worker who visits them twice a week with some food, and they also hire a private nurse for several hours a day, not necessarily every day. Plus, the relatives come to visit occasionally, and they have a constant telephone communication in case of some unforeseen problems. But the permit system to move around, which has been introduced in Moscow and some other cities, destroys this system, and it is a disaster for many families, for millions of, or dozens of millions of people affected by the situation. And this is the main format of caring for the elderly. When we talk about hospital care, Russian hospitals are traditionally not designed to cope, to care for patients without the help of their relatives. This is the tradition and the heritage of the socialist system, and it means that their relatives have higher standards of care than the state. People don't think that the state healthcare system can care for their relatives better than they can do. And therefore, traditionally, if a patient receives social support, if they have family or relatives or friends, they can be visited daily, and these people physically participate in the care process. They wash the person, they change their bed linen, etc. Or a nurse is hired, but you have to agree with the hospital for the nurse to be let in. Now, all hospitals, irrespective of virus, are closed to visitors, and they are fundamentally unable to provide the necessary care. So when we talk about the optimizing processes of our healthcare system, reduce the number of nursing staff, thinking that the relatives were going to take the burden of care, the problem has been exacerbated. And finally, the salary structure. In the public sector entities and state-funded entities and also SMEs, the payroll salary, the officially declared salary, because we have also gray salaries. So the officially declared salary usually consists of a very small salary and large bonuses, which the management can manipulate arbitrarily. Sometimes this is a transparent system, sometimes it is not transparent, but having ordered businesses and public sector organizations to continue paying their employees, the federal center cannot control what is being done and whether the salaries have not been cut to the basic minimum. So when they say that the federal center has thought hard and fast about the public sector employees by continuing to pay their salaries, but has actually shifted the burden to the private business because the private business cannot continue paying out salaries, holding people remotely, working remotely, is not going to solve the problem. So it means that the public sector entity still paying some salaries or parts of salaries to their employees. So this is all I wanted to talk about people themselves, tell you about. So people do suffer from the lockdown much more than apparent when you look at the official indicators on the reserves, etc., etc. So these special features of the Russian society are known to the authorities, but they don't have any tools to take account of them in their political decisions. And as Mikhail Borisovich has said, Putin is very much a legalistic person, but it is actually the feature of the Russian Federation as a whole. People are very formal, they follow the letter of the law, and they cannot act based on the information which has not been reflected in official documents, even if they understand that the situation is different from the official documents. So what's happening to the bureaucracy? It has proved to be impossible to stop the repressive activities of the law enforcement agencies. I'm just talking about fighting crime. So those law enforcement agencies continue to detain people at the same pace, although not only human rights defenders, but even the head of the prison service has asked the chairman of the Supreme Court to put an end to these detentions because they don't want to actually create even more cramped conditions in prisons and therefore spread the virus. But locally, all the courts are listening or following the demands of the law enforcement agencies, and at the same time, they have stopped releasing people on parole. So they don't release people at all. They postpone any releases because they think the emergency situation allows them to do that, thinking that basically now, and perhaps quite sensibly, the prisons or detention centers have become the centers of virus, breeding grounds for the virus. And the V-Day anniversary amnesty was also abolished. The Duma deputies seem to hold the opinion that the epidemiological situation in detention facilities is dire. Another thing is that the regulatory bodies still continue to check and inspect small and medium businesses. And even remotely, they continue to bombard them with the demands for accounting, reporting, and fines. And it has proved to be impossible to get help to the private sector and the real unemployed. So it's only those who already receive money from the budget who are able to get help. So those who have the special certificates, for instance, the pensioners who hold their pension card, they get certain extra payments, but the procedures of claiming any assistance from private individuals, unemployed and businesses, as soon as such procedures are announced, they are formalized because our officials cannot afford, while the regulators are being very active, to take the responsibility for their action. They have to distribute this responsibility between many individuals and many offices. So people cannot get a certificate because the municipal service office that issues such certificates has stopped or suspended its work. So people cannot prove that they have a need to move around and they cannot get the necessary certificate. At the same time, the good thing is that we now have regional variants because the responsibility has shifted to the governors partially. They undertake different things. They act differently. They decide differently or take decisions differently. And I think this variety, this diversity of the regions is not going to disappear, I think, once the situation is taken under control and the pandemic is over. Therefore, what I think is going to happen next? The lockdown is not going to be held for much longer because people are going to be disenchanted, and I think the authorities are not going to do it. Even yesterday they said that starting from the 12th of May, the new measures of coming out of the lockdown are going to be announced. And of course, I think it's premature. It's much less than other countries. Amendments. I don't think people are bothered about the amendments at the moment, and I think that when the voting is announced, people are going to go out to the polling booth to express their indignation and outrage about the authorities' activities during the quarantine or the lockdown, because I think the sentiment has changed, because the situation is changing very quickly indeed. And these are the negative changes. And at the same time, if I think that somewhere local authorities or regional authorities cope better than the rest, their ratings are going to grow. But they cannot do it without striking a deal with the law enforcement agencies. But I think the federal center is going to have to bear responsibility for the mistakes of the regional and local authorities, because the majority of those who don't cope, those thieves, as they say in Russian, who have just recently been moved into a position from Moscow. And so local people, local population would think that the blame lies squarely with the center, with the central authorities. Thank you.
Professor Evgeny, but we agreed with interpreters that we shall make a short break, 2 or 3 minutes just to relax, and then we shall come back. And next speaker will be Professor Evgeny Gontmacher.
And that was before the Ukrainian events, before the sanctions, and before the decline in oil prices. And it was clear for myself and my colleagues that the economic model and the political model in Russia together are not capable to provide for the economic growth. Then, during the few years that followed, we had the continuing crisis. For example, the GDP growth rate stood at about 0 or just above 0. The real incomes plummeted by about 10% over the past few years. Perhaps 10% is not such a huge figure, but for many families, this has been a significant decline. For some, it was 20 and even 30%. And at the beginning of this year, when we were struck by the virus, it only exacerbated the existing economic crisis in Russia. Why has it exacerbated and brought it into sharp relief? I agree with Mikhail KHODORKOVSKY. I don't think the collapse in oil prices does not really impact the economy that significantly, because when the management of the economy is good, you could still have money coming into the budget. But we have mostly SMEs that suffer from the existing model, because over the past few years, and this has been part of the economic crisis, the role of the SMEs has been declining. At the moment, we have about 20% of the population involved in SMEs. Typically in Europe, it's 50%. We have the state share of the economy, which is growing significantly. And over the 20 years of Putin's regime, the state has been increasing its share in the economy. And now, both direct and indirect control by the state over the economy stands at about 50+% of the economy. We have the system of monopolies, state monopolies, particularly in the resource areas, but in other areas as well, not just in oil and gas. And now, with the crisis and COVID-19, the government, through its inertia, is trying to support and prop up those sectors of the economy which are the large corporations, everything that has anything to do with the state. Whereas the SMEs, private businesses, as we can see by the behavior of our government today, is considered as survivors. They will survive or not, but it doesn't really matter as far as the government is concerned. And all the reserves that have been accumulated over the past years, I'm not sure whether these reserves really exist, but although I think they do exist, and constitute about 10 trillion rubles, or over $100 billion. So such reserves, as far as I understand, are being kept for another hard, critical moment. They think that at the moment, economically, the situation is not dire, but it's not critically bad. They think that those people who don't depend on the state will somehow survive during the 3 to 4 months of the epidemic. And then everything will go back to normal, back to business. We've lost the speaker. We've lost the speaker. Lost the connection. Inaudible. We've lost the speaker. But inaudible. So the SMEs that don't survive would not be able to come back to proper normal functioning. We're talking about the service sector, we're talking about hospitality industry, IT, companies and firms, consultancy firms, and so on and so forth. So what we can get in about a few months is not just a much more archaic type of economy, much more state control than we're having today, but the economy that would have absolutely no potential of growth. And most likely, given the collapse in oil prices, and therefore smaller revenues to the budget, because we have a deficit of budget, because we had a surplus in the past and allowed us to have some reserves, but now we have a deficit, and we will get a completely different picture of different internal challenges to the economic stability than we had before the coronavirus. And as far as I am concerned, Putin has absolutely no plan on how to act. All his plans could be reduced in 2018 when he became president yet again, could be reduced to the May decree about 14 national goals. Without any foundation to those goals, he said that the rate of growth should be above average global rate of growth, and we always had it below average, and it's going to stay below average definitely now. Then he also decreed that we have to develop the exports and different manufacturing industries, but how can we develop them when we have such inefficient governance? It also declared that we have to reduce poverty twofold, halve it, but the prospects that we have now with the archaic model of the economy means that the poverty is only going to grow. So now there is a demand, and sociologists show that even ordinary people are craving change. They were talking about it before the pandemic, linked to the amendments to the constitution that Mikhail Borisovich was talking about, and people were already disaffected by those amendments. But now the trial by coronavirus, the test by coronavirus, when the government has absolutely no plan on what to do next, is particularly worrying, because Russia might end up not just in a stagnant situation, but in a depression. And it will be negative growth from which it won't be able to get out. It would be good to embark on the reforms now, because the economic reforms and political reforms are overdue. And of course, you cannot have economic reforms without political reforms. They are long overdue. And many people realize that now. And in terms of their scale, they should be similar to those reforms that were carried out at the beginning of the 1990s with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And in order to do that, you have completely different figures coming to power, new ideas, but unfortunately we don't see any such changes on the horizon. And in conclusion, I would like to say that today politics determines everything, including its economic development. Look at the European countries, democratic countries. The governments change, oppositions come to power, and vice versa. So the economy and the principles on which it is based, we've lost the speaker, continue to function normally, irrespective of the change of government. So we don't have a situation that when people in power can ensure the stability of economic institutions that would operate notwithstanding the change of government. So we have a very difficult situation, and I'm afraid while Putin is in power and takes the main decisions, he will never envisage the change or any change politically, because this would undermine the basis of his own stay in power. And finally, what we can see in the economy and then the social sphere, perhaps not tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, but in some foreseeable future. Again, we've lost the speaker. Lost the speaker. So basically there must be some shake-up. Unfortunately, the transition of power from the existing one to the one that we would like to see is not going to happen evolutionary. It might resemble something we had in 1991, an overthrow, and we have to get ready for that. At least my colleagues and myself have been debating that and discussing how it could pan out. Thank you.
Спасибо, professor. Спасибо, thanks a lot. I forgot my duty, switch on my microphone and so on. So, last speaker, Anastasia Burakova, chairperson of Open Russia since April 2018, and also very well-known human rights advocate and defender of and the founder of United Democrats Project. So, Anastasia, please, floor is yours.
Всем добрый день. В части законодательных мер,
Good afternoon. In terms of the legislative measures taken by the federal authorities, I think the federal authorities have withdrawn, disengaged from the process, and devolved to the regions any measures to fight COVID-19. And due to the lack of true political competition and true federalism in previous years, regional authorities began to take decisions that contravene both the constitution and the existing federal laws. The federal authorities tried to avoid taking unpopular decisions and at the same time not to take any obligations to economically support Russian citizens, as previous speakers pointed out. And in this situation, when the regional governors, regional leaders who are not being directly elected are poorly qualified to act in this situation because they have been brought into office without any competition, they have started taking decisions which have restricted not just the freedom of movement of people in Russia in the lockout situation, but also other constitutional rights and freedoms. For instance, they cannot appeal to the government bodies or try to defend their own infringed rights. There have been cases when people were administratively fined or other penalties were brought against them for just filing a report with the police. So somebody went to the police to file a report and they were fined for violating the regime of self-isolation or lockout. So we have the situation when many years of absence of competition at the regional and federal level have played a dirty trick on legislators, because the regions have great powers now to take their own measures, but nobody has managed to do it properly. The media and social networks began to spread information about the lack of PPEs for doctors. Unfortunately, all the federal channels broadcast images of Kommunarka, the main infection diseases hospital in Moscow. So they go there, record documentary films there, and they show it on all the federal channels. But outside Moscow, the situation is dire. And of course, the situation is dire because you cannot show the inefficiency or demonstrate it openly. Either the management of the hospital or the regional governors, they are not allowed to demonstrate their weaknesses. So basically, they are washing the disposable masks, they are washing disposable PPEs to reuse them again and again. And the government adopts the new law on fake news, which envisages or provides for both administrative and criminal penalties. And the biggest problem has arisen in closed institutions, military academies, penal system, prison system, military towns and cities. You cannot control there the situation and what's happening to the coronavirus infection because of the quarantine. Access by relatives and lawyers has been restricted, and you cannot find out what is happening inside. Any information that leaks out and any whistleblower who publishes this information is being prosecuted according to the new law on fake news. For instance, the Jailed Russia, which is an organization that provides assistance to prisoners, and also the police ombudsman published some information about the coronavirus spread in a penal colony. Criminal proceedings have been brought against them. They have been penalized for publishing information about the infection. in detention facilities and military academies. Our lawyers have been handling all these cases. We also have created the Center for Assistance to Russian Citizens during the pandemic. We have a bot mail and email where Russians can get advice on the infringement of their rights, file complaints, and make statements about the violations of their rights. And the largest number of complaints concerns the breach of labor rights and also the rights of doctors who haven't been provided with the PPE, and also anything to do with the fake news legislation I mentioned. Over the period of 3 weeks, our lawyers processed over 120 applications, and complaints, and they're also handling the most sensational cases when people are being prosecuted for fake news and spreading fake news. Also, our Human Rights OP organization monitors infringement of citizens' rights, which is the right about on social media, and which are covered by mass media, and offer them assistance. One of such cases that I've been dealing with personally is the mass infection in a hospital in St. Petersburg of doctors and medical staff. I will explain the situation. The system of restoring the infringed rights, labor rights, doesn't work. The prosecutor's office doesn't react to any complaints, and therefore the doctors are afraid to speak openly about the problems they experience. And their management also forbids them to speak openly about the existing problems. In Pokrovka, in St. Petersburg, the doctors complained about the absence of PPEs and also the absence of oxygen supplies, despite the fact that they're fighting COVID-19 and they need both the artificial ventilation of lungs and also the oxygen supplies. And then the regional authorities published the disclaimer saying that no, this is not happening. And 3 days after we sent a request to the federal bodies, the criminal case about the negligence that was opened brought into light 62 cases of infection of coronavirus infection in the same hospital among doctors. So we're trying to bring to justice both the chief medical officer of the hospital and the regional officials who have allowed the situation to develop. We have a similar case in the Vladimir region, and unfortunately the number of such complaints and applications by doctors is growing. We have cases when the doctors don't have the most essential supplies, but they cannot speak about it openly because they could be prosecuted using this new legislation on spreading fake news. At the same time, we have a lot of grassroots initiatives in Russia which are springing up, of mutual assistance initiatives. For instance, Open Russia has started fundraising to help doctors. So we have hot lunches being delivered by volunteers, because now doctors work several shifts and they don't leave hospitals, sometimes for days, or they're closed for quarantine because coronavirus has been for them. Yesterday, we had the situation when the ambulances, who we helped last week, buying PPEs for them, and the doctors who accepted our gift, and then the chief medical officer had to write a complaint about us, saying that we are lying, that it is fraud, and asked us to remove the PPEs because they don't want to demonstrate that they have problems, to make it obvious. So the chief medical officers usually stick with the officials. They don't want to reveal the real nature of the situation, the real disaster. We have already raised more than 12,000 euros as part of this project. We are constantly helping 11 hospitals in a number of Russian regions, including St. Petersburg, where we started. And now we're spreading our assistance to other regions and also to the clinics that specialize in COVID-19. we continue this project. It is quite successful despite the opposition and obstacles created by the regional officials and the medical officers. We also launched another project called Covidarity or Covidarnost, and where our activists participate, organize neighborhood mutual assistance networks, and about 1,500 volunteers or 2,000 volunteers have put up ads in their apartment blocks about helping different risk groups, for instance, providing lunches, food to the elderly or people who are chronically ill and sitting in isolation, maybe walking their dogs, bring some medicines, or providing some other assistance and help. And this project has become popular across Russia. As I said, we have about 2,000 volunteers who we are in constant contact with, but there is also a larger number of people who are also supporting this project and providing assistance. So there are some positive developments, because people under the threat of infection, threat to their life, to their health, are speaking out. They're beginning to talk about their problems despite of the risk of being sacked, dismissed, or punished. We have horizontal self-assistance groups, because in the past, such horizontal links didn't exist. So now such horizontal links are emerging and taking shape. Thank you.
I will try to...
Теперь я постараюсь начать наши вопросы и ответы. Есть целый ряд вопросов, которые я получил в чате. Начну со своего собственного вопроса, с первого. Михаилу. Простой вопрос. Что произойдет с выборами в Думу в следующем году и с президентскими выборами в 2024 году? Профессор сказал, что нужны изменения, нужны реформы. В общем-то, типа перестройки. Можно ли представить себе, что выборы принесут какие-то настоящие изменения уже в следующем году? Или это просто невозможно даже себе представить?
Мне хотелось бы.
I would like to believe that such changes were possible, but my previous experience shows that Putin's instincts would work to the contrary, as far as I'm concerned. If before this situation, he at least discussed the idea of allowing some opposition into the State Duma, be it controlled, non-systemic, but still the opposition. Now, for him, this would be excessive democracy as far as he is concerned. At the same time, the Russian society, I think, is going to be quite disenfranchised, irritated by the ongoing events, and despite his attempts to perhaps inject some cash inevitably into the economy, the protest voting level is going to be very high. On voting for the communists, Zyuganov's party, for the nationalists, i.e. Zhirinovsky, or others. All those that they might allow into the Duma. Or are there going to be a greater number of those opposition figures in the State Duma, or would there be vote rigging, greater vote rigging? This is something for Putin to decide. When we talk about 2024, it's too premature to speak about those elections, but the chance is that Putin will have to go, to leave the stage. Even the chance of it has become greater, I think, that he might have to leave the stage. Спасибо за ваш ответ. Следующие два вопроса объединю от Анны Бутыги и Питера Броса. Геополитические вопросы. Хочу задать их Михаилу. Анна Футига спросила, ваше отношение к аннексии Крыма и к агрессии в Украине. И какое у вас отношение, и что вы думаете о российско-китайских отношениях после, когда закончится эпидемия или в эру после COVID-19? The entire Ukrainian story or saga was obviously thought up and conducted by Putin in order to strengthen his ratings in 2014, which he succeeded in doing. What happened in what happened in Crimea was enthusiastically received in Russia by the population. What happened in Donbass was not received so enthusiastically by Russian societies. So the positive part, positive for Putin and for his government, part of these two extremely criminal decisions has been exhausted. And the negative part, i.e. the sanctions, continues to undermine, and I've spoken about it in my presentation, undermine the personal legitimacy of Putin, irrespective of his own declarations that everything is fine. And I think it is very important here to consider the situation in Ukraine itself, Zelensky and his team and their work. What I can see at the moment does not fill me with lots of joy, but there is still time for him and his team, and I hope he makes good use of this time. Going to China now. There is a certain warmth in relations between Xi and Putin, which is well known. And nevertheless, China's pragmatism, its readiness to use the situation to its own advantage from the difficult situation his counterparty finds themselves in, is now apparent to Putin as well. And I don't see or foresee any expansion of relations between Russia and China. В чате Мири Лексман, европейский депутат из Словакии. Вопрос такой. История говорит о том, что российский народ может переносить разные тяготы и проблемы. И поэтому многие режимы остаются у власти очень долго. Теперь уже ситуация подошла к критической точке. Гражданское общество, а также различные сети взаимопомощи могут помочь в этой ситуации. Тоже может быть вопрос Михаилу. For us, the most significant problem is the extremely low level of trust which exists within the Russian society, which distinguishes it from, in my view, many other European societies. We, and when I say we, I mean the Russian opposition, the Russian civil society, we are trying to strengthen this trust, this confidence within, including through such situations, difficult situations that we face today with the epidemic. Sometimes we succeed, particularly in larger cities, sometimes requires longer, more time, and this is a problem for us. От Анны Иммануэльсон. Я хочу спросить следующий вопрос. А действия Европейского парламента как-то влияют на вашу работу? Например, когда Европейский парламент принимает резолюцию по ситуации с правами человека и так далее. Я тоже хочу задать следующий вопрос. А вообще население получает какие-то новости, которые не были отфильтрованы федеральными каналами по COVID-19? Реальные новости. Кто хочет ответить на это? Well, as far as the news is concerned, we do have the internet, nevertheless. And with some exceptions, it has been blocked. It has not been blocked yet. There are some websites that have been blocked, but people have got around this system of blockages using different alternatives. So those who want to find out the real information and who have access to the internet can get any information they want about what is happening in the country and in the world. It is very important. Yes, federal channels, of course, are totally controlled by the government, spewing out propaganda. Sometimes it's really bad for your mental health to watch those channels, but the internet gives us the opportunity to get information, particularly younger people, more active people, the activists, for example, of our civil society. Those who do this type of work get information. Another matter is what conclusions they draw from the information they receive. As far as the European Parliament is concerned and its role, when I visit Brussels, for example, and recently I made a visit to Brussels and I in fact met Mr. Kubilius during my visit, it is a classic question which is being asked. What can we do in order to improve the situation in Russia, we are being asked. Well, the old methods used in the 1990s when there was direct financial assistance, consultancy assistance to Russia have gone. Those times have gone, unfortunately. Now, it is particularly important to hold fora like this one. We should have as many as possible such fora, including our experts, including our civil society activists. We cannot hold such fora offline, which was difficult even in the best of times because it was expensive. It required flights and hotels. But now we can use the social media, we can hold such events online, the sort of 21st century type of forum, including Russians and different projects in discussions and debates in Europe, please do not forget that we are Europeans as well. At least we want to be European. Although our government, our leaders think differently, but that doesn't bother us. We want to be European and remain European. So you need to support us intellectually this way. And I think this would be the most important thing today. Я всегда шучу и говорю, что, по крайней мере, одна хорошая вещь, результат этой пандемии, это то, что мы будем знать, как пользоваться правильно интернетом для того, чтобы проводить такого рода дискуссии и дебаты. У нас открываются новые возможности, и мы сможем продолжать наш диалог. И наш форум действительно создает, форум друзей Европейской России, как раз создавался для того, чтобы с вами и с другими обсуждать все эти проблемы, как Запад, как Европейский Союз может помогать России, чтобы ее опять вернуть в демократическое европейское русло. Мы не теряем надежды. Мы надеемся, что она вернется в это русло. Не знаем, сколько это займет, но это произойдет. Мы не наивные люди. Мы понимаем, что сразу это не произойдет, но мы уверены, что Россия заслуживает европейского будущего. И я надеемся, что оно настанет. И будем делать все, что необходимо, и все, что мы можем, для того, чтобы его приблизить и помочь России преобразоваться в нормальную демократическую страну. Я вижу еще один вопрос. Сейчас пытаюсь его найти. Это коллега из Европарламента Словении, социал-демократы, бывший министр здравоохранения и министр обороны, и бывший врач. Очень конкретный вопрос. Россия способна в достаточной мере обеспечить защитными средствами, масками, перчатками, которые производятся именно в России? Или ей нужно импортировать все это из других стран, может быть, из Китая или из других стран? Кто может ответить на этот вопрос? Пожалуйста, Элла, вам слово. Хорошо, окей. Как и многие другие страны, в России недостаточно производится такого рода средств защиты, и ей нужно их импортировать. Мы используем большое количество защитных средств импортных, даже и до эпидемии пользовались такими средствами. Да, ответ да. России необходим импорт. Вижу, понимаю. Еще один вопрос. Это, наверное, последний вопрос, который мы зачитаем. Из Украины. От Ганны Гопко, бывший представитель комитета по международным делам предыдущей Рады, Верховной Рады. Интересный вопрос. В прошлом году Верховная Рада приняла обращение в поддержку различных национальных меньшинств, коренных народов Российской Федерации. Она говорит, это очень важно поддерживать национальные меньшинства и коренные народы в Российской Федерации. Какую роль может сыграть Украина и ЕС для того, чтобы поддерживать людей, которые живут в России, которые борются за свободу и хотят лучшее будущее для России? Что можно сделать? Кто хочет ответить на этот вопрос Украины? Что может сделать Украина и ЕС? Поддержать людей, борющихся за свободу в России и борющихся за лучшее будущее. Михаил, вы хотите ответить на этот вопрос? Не вижу желающих. Может быть, Анастасия? Пожалуйста. Михаил, хорошо, Михаил.
Анастасия, если возможно.
Анастасия, все-таки вы.
Я как человек, который не так...
Who stopped official studies and PhD quite recently, I can tell you what can be done. Unfortunately, 80% of Russians cannot travel abroad. They don't have a foreign passport that allows them to leave Russia and travel abroad. So with the monopoly of government on the media, the majority of people in the regions get the information, unfortunately, from state channels, from state television, and listen to state propaganda starting from 2014, as far as European countries were concerned, Russia's neighborhood was concerned. There has been hatred propagated by propaganda channels, and they're not talking about cooperation or partnership anymore. It's not just the question of difference of opinion. They're trying to breed hate. And I think it's very important to engage horizontally at the level of civil society and the level of education. For instance, having events involving students, not just in Moscow and St. Petersburg, because Moscow and St. Petersburg are very different from the rest of Russia. People there travel abroad, they have other contacts with foreign organizations. They travel as tourists abroad as well. But there should be an emphasis made on inviting people from regions, from regional universities, to hold discussions, debates at the level of civil society, and to develop people's diplomacy, people-to-people diplomacy. And when we talk about Ukraine, to organize some sort of trips, study trips for such people who don't see the world, the outside world, and get all the information mostly from television and propaganda channels, from state channels. There was a project, Ukraine with its own eyes, but it was aimed mostly at large cities and at the people who have a chance to travel abroad and have some certain level of education and development in order to understand this information and spread it further. So these are good programs. And they allow people to learn more about European countries, neighboring countries. So such people's diplomacy would be the best way to normalize relations and to improve them. Because once you've seen something with your own eyes, if you're an expert or a young person, if it is an exchange, for instance, for professionals, could then take this information to the rest of his circle, in his circle, and change their opinion and change their take on the world. Спасибо. Я хочу сказать, что у нас прошли очень интересные обсуждения, интересные. Я очень коротко постараюсь подвести итоги. Может быть, Михаил ко мне присоединится тоже в подведении этих итогов, это будет замечательно, но я хочу сделать следующий вывод. На самом деле, такого рода диалог очень важен, обсуждения очень важны. Именно поэтому мы создали наш форум. Россия – великая страна. К сожалению, сейчас она страдает из-за целого ряда проблем. У нас мечта наладить хорошие отношения с Россией, а это будет зависеть от того, как будет трансформироваться Россия, как она будет меняться, от демократических изменений в этой стране. Некоторые из моих коллег, мы верим в то, что, и я сам, верим в то, что у России светлое будущее демократии европейского стиля. Может быть, не все разделяют на Западе эту мечту, эту идею, поэтому некоторые хотят, наоборот, наладить хорошие отношения с Путиным. Я считаю, что это неправильный, ложный путь, по которому идти не стоит. Я очень ценю ваше участие. Большое спасибо всем выступавшим. Надеюсь, что мы продолжим это общение. Мне нравится интернет. Мне нравится общаться по интернету. Гораздо легче организовывать такого рода мероприятия в интернете. Всегда, конечно, приветствуем и лицом к лицу встречи, но не знаем, когда они будут происходить в следующий раз. В Брюсселе, в Вильнюсе, какое-то время в Вильнюсе будем проводить какие-то мероприятия. Хочу поблагодарить Открытую Россию, Марию Логан, переводчицу и нашу команду. Манту, Катю, Йонаса, всех остальных. Михаил, хотите сказать несколько слов в заключение?
Спасибо большое.
Thank you very much for organizing this event, for moderating this event. I really do think that the world has been given a kick in the butt to harness the new technologies and ways of communication. And I'm absolutely confident that all the drawbacks and difficulties with the power of communication networks that are being identified today are going to be removed and ironed out by the market. And this would allow us to communicate in a better and easier fashion. I do want to confirm that the opportunity to involve in such meetings people who can talk about their own experience, their own research, their own impressions, is much simpler and easier than through other channels of communication. So if there is such an interest in participation, we could be joined by people from a variety of Russian towns and cities. And I do hope, very much hope, that at some point we'll get some reciprocal information from experts and people in Europe who want to share with their Russian colleagues about what is happening in their countries today and in their cities today. Thank you so much for organizing this event, and I was very happy to be useful.
Переводит все. Thanks a lot, really, to our colleagues from Parliament. We shall continue, what we enjoyed today. Thanks a lot to everybody. See you later. Okay, bye.